We are now recording.
Hey. Hi, everybody. So my name is Mandy Maxwell. I am an environmental planner based in North Central Washington. And as Shirley mentioned, I'm supporting this project with the community engagement and outreach component. And we have been conducting a bit of a city tour around Douglas County to introduce the work we are currently engaging with the county on to update the hazard mitigation plan. And so we also wanted to make sure there was an opportunity available for folks to learn about the process and also ask questions if you're not able to attend an in-person event. And we'll go over it later in the presentation, but we also have more opportunities coming up for the community to get engaged in this process. And I will quickly give Shirley a moment to reintroduce herself so that it's in the recording.
Thank you so much. I'm Shirley Schultz, and I work with Anchor QEA, and I am doing the project management for this project. I'm working with Mandy and working with staff and experts in resiliency and hazard mitigation and hazard analysis and all things planning. So thank you, Mandy.
Yeah. So in this presentation, we are going to look at a high level, what is the hazard mitigation plan? What is the process of updating the plan every 5 years look like? What's included, what's not included? Some of the things that we already know about Douglas County and looking and reflecting on, the last 5 years and what that means in terms of the update that we are currently looking at. Talking a bit about some new planning requirements for the state regarding climate resilience and how that is being incorporated into the hazard mitigation plan, and then talking a bit more about our upcoming community engagement and outreach opportunities. And then we want to leave some time for questions and feedback as well. A big part of this process is hearing directly from community members to get feedback on lived experiences and what it's like in different parts of the county, depending on the types of natural hazards or different events that occur, whether it's wildfire or extreme snow drifts during winter. Really, this plan, the hazard mitigation plan, belongs to the people, and so reflecting the voice of the people in this plan is really important. So, and here's the agenda. So I'll just breeze past that. So, Shirley, I will pass it over to you if you want to do these first few slides.
Yes, as soon as I locate my audio button again. So the first few slides talk about what a hazard mitigation plan is. And a hazard mitigation plan is a FEMA approved document. So it goes through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and it talks about hazards that a community might face due to emergency hazards and the vulnerability of the people, buildings, infrastructure. So it's populations who may have trouble getting evacuated. It's storm lines that might overflow in a flood event. It might be a fire station that is at risk of a landslide or something like that. It works with the entire community to talk about goals, actions, things that you can do ahead of time to be ready for a hazard that may or will is likely to occur. And then it can help with investments over time. So there's grant money both at the federal level and the state level to help get ready for those hazards and emergencies as they happen. So this is a federal requirement for funding access. If you want to look at any of those grants or those fundings for that preparation, it's been around 20, 25 years. It's supposed to be updated every 5 years. So Douglas County's a little bit behind in getting theirs done, but it is a very good, well, in this case, resilience building, community building tool. It gets people talking about what can we do before a fire comes? What can we do before there's a flood? Next slide. So this is the cycle on risk mitigation. The plan is for all of Douglas County, so the unincorporated areas where people live outside of cities, but it's also the cities and other organizations, public organizations, and some private that are within the county. So we're talking to the different cities and how they will adopt this hazard mitigation plan. Fire districts, school districts, conservation districts, public utilities. We'll have conversations with the tribe. We'll have conversations with the Red Cross and the health department, and we'll probably get to that in a minute. But the little wheel there on the left of the screen talks about how it's a cycle. And so, like any circle, right, there's no end. You move through the cycle over and over. You plan, you learn, you change things. Then the next time you take another bite at that apple. Next slide. So we talk about mitigation under hazard mitigation planning. One of the things that's been, I think, a learning experience for me and something that I'm getting better at is explaining the difference between emergency response and emergency planning. So a lot of times we'll be out, and this happened when I talked to the Board of County Commissioners, was, well, we have a great operations plan and we have a really great fire chief who will be out and when the fire happens, and that's great to have, but that's not what the mitigation plan is. So this table talks about what we do ahead of time, right? It's talking about a bridge to withstand flooding. It is getting houses with less flammable materials around them so that if or when there's a wildfire, it's less likely to actually catch the structure on fire. It talks about building codes, so helping people realize that maybe a wooden deck in a fire-prone area is not the best addition to their house versus, oh, we had a fire. How do we help people rebuild their decks, which is afterwards? Or when you talk about floods, elevating structures versus helping people clean up after a flood, sizing a culvert big enough to handle a flood versus cleaning the mud out of the culvert afterwards. So that's kind of the difference between a mitigation plan and emergency response plan. Next slide. So this is again back to the 5-year update. One, it helps things stay fresh. You know things that change, or there's a new hazard or something, maybe hopefully not a horrible disaster, but they happen, and you learn things from them. Or we got new data. The world is changing, so sometimes you see more and more flood days. I know personally we see more fire days and we see a lot more smoke. So the 5 years allows that circle from that earlier slide to just keep moving around. And we go back and we say, what did we accomplish in the last 5 years? And did we make the right choices? And are we still not getting to some things that are important, and why not? Next one. So here's where we are on what changes and what stays. FEMA and the state of Washington, all the way down to the county level, have a really firm planning framework that talks about what you talk about and who you go to and what goes in this hazard mitigation plan, and how to work with the community. So that's not going to change. Community profiles, right? If you had a school in 2020, the chances are your school probably still exists now and is still a very valuable asset to your community. That moves forward. And those agencies that work with. So the Red Cross and the health department and the fire department and the sheriff's department all still relate to each other. So that goes forward. But what we update are hazards. Like I said, they happen. Different ones happen. There's different intensities. Different things happen as a result of those hazards. So what do we learn from them? Vulnerability. People move. People live in different places. Trees die and a hillside might become unstable. So those are the kinds of things that can change over time and need to be updated. Again, as I mentioned, previous plan actions, one of the things I've been really happy when talking to the cities is how many people now have generators for when power goes out, and they still need to be able to run communications or the water pumps for their wells, where they didn't necessarily have reliable generators before. And then based on all of that, where do we go from here? So what are the ideas for the next 5 years? Do those priorities change? You know, things now when everybody has a cell phone is a lot different than they would have been in about 2002, right? Access to the internet, access to immediate communication changes. So those are going to rank differently on your priorities. Um, Different participating jurisdictions, more schools this time. And then also, and I think Mandy's going to talk more about this, but climate integration. So the state passed laws that talk about climate resiliency as we have more storms, more heat days, higher fire danger, bigger floods. And one of the ways that counties and cities who do planning are allowed to address that is through doing their hazard mitigation plan. So it gets integrated into the big overarching plans for the county. Did I cover it? Oh yeah.
Did.
This is, are you going from here or?
No, you go.
I'll go. Okay. We didn't rehearse. So this is where we are. It's a pretty quick timeline. Like I said, Douglas County is already behind. And the desire is to incorporate some of the goals and policies, or at least address them in that comprehensive plan, which, has a year and a half head start. So there, and you may know this, you may be involved. There is the comprehensive plan effort that's going on. There have been a ton of meetings. There will be more meetings. The next one's May 20th, for the big public meeting. We want to be able to put some of the big actions into that. It's not the full hazard mitigation plan. It won't have the full list of priorities. That will be later this year. So there will be things happening throughout the summer. There will be more public interaction, and everything should be coming back to the County Board of Commissioners and all the city councils in October. Okay. Is it back to you still? Is it back to you yet?
I'm happy to do this one if you want me to
It's
take
all
over.
yours. Take it over. I need a drink of
Okay.
water.
Yeah, thank you, Shirley. So, as we are beginning our assessments and vulnerability and risk assessments and updating the community profiles, we just really ground on the profile and the character, and especially the geographic character of Douglas County, because it's very unique even compared to its neighboring counties. And so, one of the unique things about Douglas County is it's a really large county in area and square miles, but it has relatively low density, and that is because of the mix of rural and urban communities, and so that is something that is lived out when we're looking at hazard events, thinking about wildfires that have occurred, or rock slides or landslides that might take out a road that is the only route for a community member to be able to take to get out of their community. And so these are significant considerations when looking at the ability for the county to mitigate risks, especially as it pertains to life and safety for community members. And the geographic character, it's interesting because a lot of the county is that high desert plateau, so that Waterville plateau where a lot of the wheat grows, and you don't see irrigation there. Because they're able to be dry crop fields, but then you go down closer to East Wenatchee in the Columbia River corridor, and then you start to see more wine grapes and tree fruit species, and very different types of agriculture. And then there's obviously rangeland, and there are some forested areas. There's a whole lot of shrub steppe. And as the communities are growing and getting closer to some of these wildland spaces, that is increasing the wildland urban interface. And we look at this when we're assessing wildfire risk and community exposure to wildfire risk. So the natural hazards that are looked at generally in a hazard mitigation plan are wildfire, severe storms and weather, severe winter weather, flooding, extreme precipitation, drought and extreme heat, and earthquakes and geologic hazards. I'm going to go into these just a little bit more because some feel very relevant to Douglas County, and some may feel not quite relevant. But I think there are some certain areas where maybe a hazard hasn't been a significant issue today or in the past, but because of changing climate dynamics and some of the things that Shirley had mentioned earlier, we may see a bit more exposure and potentially more risk to those hazards in the future. So first looking at wildfire and why it matters, there's not a lot of forest to burn, but as folks have experienced, but before and in recent past, Douglas County is adjacent to Chelan County, and sometimes we send our fires over to you, unfortunately, and they jump the river, and so that is still a concern, and especially when you're thinking about all of that sagebrush and all of that brush ecosystem and high winds that allows fire to spread incredibly fast. As I just mentioned, the growing wildland urban interface areas putting more properties at risk of wildfire. And then just thinking about climate conditions that are changing and drier, hotter summers, those big winds, those all help create fire weather. And again, we've, seen some pretty significant fires even in the past 5 years. So thinking about even the Pearl Hill fire that happened up on the northern part of the county, and how it essentially locked communities in because major evacuation routes were taken out. And so that's a situation that will be assessed as part of the hazard mitigation plan to identify what can potentially be mitigated so that those evacuation routes are reliable the next time something like that happens. And so some of the things that, and I won't do this for all of the hazards, but thinking about what we're tracking in this process, it's the acres of the wildland urban interface. Like, what is the change between the 2020 update and now? How has that grown? Thinking about the ignition of structures, right? How are older structures or older housing stock more vulnerable to ignition, and thinking about ember cast, which can and has in Douglas County traveled for miles. Again, as I mentioned, the evacuation issues, thinking about capacity of those evacuation routes or even the choke points on evacuation routes. And then also fire suppression resource capacity. And that, gets a little bit more into the emergency response, where we've got pretty incredible response capabilities locally, and then you add in that mutual aid, and we're pretty lucky out in our part of the state. But that is something that is assessed in this process. So thinking about severe storms. So again, we've talked about wind. We know that these wind events are can be really disruptive, and they also can get worse. And so thinking about also damage to power infrastructure, what it does to agriculture. The photo on the slide actually shows after a windstorm and how dust is just completely saturated a field that was previously green. And thinking about structural damage as well. Also power outages, and thinking about vulnerable populations that are not capable of hanging out for extended periods of time without power, especially people who depend on medical equipment that is powered by electricity. And again, these severe storms can compound wildfire conditions. So flooding is interesting because there are not a whole lot of floodplains in Douglas County. There are some, but not a whole lot, especially as you go inland. But as we know, seasonal precipitation and rain on snow events can cause a lot of erosion, and even thinking about flash flooding that happens in those canyon areas, or those seasonal creeks. And so a lot of washouts can happen, rock falls, rock slides on roads. And so I think it's pretty common to see parts of the main highways being worked on every single season. And so there are in this process the FEMA flood maps, they get updated on their own cycle, but there is new FEMA flood data since the last update, and so that'll be evaluated in this process. And then severe winter weather. So for some areas, it's a whole bunch of snow, and for other areas, it is crazy snow drifts or ice storms. And I think everybody is pretty exposed to those extreme cold events. And so those are really significant because, again, thinking about isolation of some of the smaller communities in the county. Thinking about agricultural losses. So those freeze thaw events are really bad for especially tree fruit crops. And again, thinking about vulnerable populations. And so people who don't have housing that is either safe and reliable or backup options for heating and so on. And, you know, making sure residents are able to safely heat their homes in these events or have access to electricity or backup generators. And as we've seen, and you can see in the top photo there, the plateau communities can experience really harsh conditions. And I know there have been scenarios where communities have basically been locked in during a snowstorm, a snowdrift storm. So earthquakes and geologic hazards, just really quickly, you know, Douglas County isn't near the highest seismic zones that we see on the more western side of the state, but it doesn't mean that it's not immune. And so it's really important to look at factors like liquefaction and other results of seismic events, especially landslides. And so because we have significant seismic risk in the state, that is something that gets assessed carefully in this process. And also thinking about community members. And even though it may be more likely that we get an alert to evacuate because of a fire, you know, in the event of an earthquake, there are things that community members can do to be prepared. And then the last primary, so thinking about drought and extreme heat, again, Douglas County is in a really unique situation in terms of its water. You know, not only is it surrounded by the Columbia River, which is a pretty reliable water source, but also because of the underground water sources and the pretty consistent recharge from those sources, which is why so much of the agriculture happens without the irrigation assistance. But those droughts still affect the county, and especially because, you know, it is another exacerbating factor for wildfire. And then also, you know, extreme heat. And I know in this part of the state, we're pretty resilient and accustomed to high temperatures. But when we look at the longer and more frequent heat waves or those heat dome events, they can have significant risks for especially vulnerable people or outdoor workers. And then just quickly, some of the other hazards that are reviewed in the process. So thinking about hazardous material incidents, dam failures, infrastructure failure, and also public health emergencies, which I think most notably and recently, you know, COVID-19 made it very apparent that, you know, this needs to be part of hazard mitigation for communities as well. Shirley, is there anything that you would want to add to that and the hazards I went over?
I was trying to think of another one, but the public health emergency probably covers it. We covered smoke with high heat and wildfires, and I think those are the ones that are most impactful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so who and what is at risk? So when we are looking at hazard mitigation, most importantly, we are looking at people. So this is all community members, but really making sure we're addressing the impacts on elderly residents, low-income households, rural, more isolated residents, agricultural workers, which is obviously a very significant part of the economy in the county and is critical to make sure that we are able to keep our economies moving while protecting workers. And in Washington state, we do have a lot of state level regulation that helps guide this as well. Property and infrastructure is assessed. So thinking about the vulnerability of homes in the WUI areas, infrastructure like irrigation infrastructure, again, in the parts of the county that have it, roads and bridges, power transmission lines, which there are many, and then agricultural facilities and crops. Obviously, there's, aside from the crops that are grown, there's a lot of agriculture adjacent packing, distribution facilities in the county as well. So as we talked about the new state requirement for climate resilience, this was enacted in 2023, and as communities are updating their comprehensive plans or their hazard mitigation plans, the state now requires not just to look at what hazards are we exposed to today, what are the extent of those risks today, but how can those hazards and how can that risk change over time? So looking out on a horizon of 20 years or longer, so even just thinking to mid-century, the next 25-ish years, what will the actions that we are coming up with today still be durable then? Are those investments going to account for those potential changes and those potential future conditions? And because of this legislation, through the state, that has made funding available to all jurisdictions in Washington state to be able to do this work. So in terms of integrating climate into the hazard mitigation plan, so as Shirley mentioned, there's 3 pathways to put climate resilience into the plans for Douglas County. One would be in the comprehensive plan, 2 as an element, so as its own chapter, similar to utilities or parks and rec. 2 would be to just have goals and policies for that are resilient, that would be incorporated in the components of a comprehensive plan. Or the third option is to bring the resilience component into the hazard mitigation plan update. And then the hazard mitigation plan gets adopted by reference into the comprehensive plan. And so that is the pathway that Douglas County has taken. And it's really beneficial because, again, we're looking at natural hazards for the most part, aside from a few other hazards that we just looked at. And so our ability as we're assessing those natural hazards today and looking at what's changed and where we're at, we're just adding on that layer of better understanding future conditions that might necessitate different actions that we take. So the first thing we'll do is we update the hazard profiles with those future conditions. The second thing is testing the mitigation actions. And so really it's a litmus test to understand, is this action going to hold up? And this really helps to avoid maladaption, which is something that might seem applicable and perfect for today, but ends up becoming invalidated later. And for communities like ours, where resources and financial resources are limited, we have to be really strategic about what we do, and especially as we're asking for money from FEMA or from the state. And so the overall benefit is just to make sure we have really durable actions that are going to sustain us for the coming decades. And then also prioritizing those actions with those long-term co-benefits. And so thinking about how an action might mitigate hazard, but also build long-term resilience in a community. And then we link to the other plans. And so most notably here, this is connecting it with the county's comprehensive plan. So just some examples of what resilient mitigation actions might look like. So traditionally in an HMP, we would see home hardening for a wildfire. To make this resilient would be adding in prioritizing the most high risk WUI zones that are more exposed under these changing conditions. And so it's, again, just being able to look a bit out into the future and say, based on where we're developing and how we're developing, these are some areas that we might want to look at. Other examples, thinking about a flood warning system. Again, that's not, it's relevant to a few pockets of the community, but especially if we have a dam failure, I think there's a lot more exposure if we're talking about a dam failure and not just a weather generated flood. So this would be thinking about, designing for more intense and variable storm events, or thinking about long-term decision making for dams and dam retrofits and structural integrity. Shirley mentioned earlier the investment in generators, especially since the last few fires and the Pearl Hill fire, where communities were definitely in Mansfield, and I think in Bridgeport as well, potentially other communities, because the power was out because of the fire. Water was not produced because the pumps for the water required electricity. And then that also means that communication is down. That means that critical facilities or a safe gathering space doesn't have power. And so now those communities have been able to invest in backup generators so that they can have some continuity of those critical services during a hazard event. And then, so that kind of wraps up the hazard piece and what we're looking at and how we're bringing climate into this. And really, again, why we're here and why we're showing up at different events and creating different spaces for community members to share their input is because at the end of the day, things that planners don't know. So that local knowledge, the understanding of neighborhood dynamics, neighborhood conditions, what's changed, what an experience was like for you is incredibly important for us to take into consideration because, again, this is your plan. This is for the community members of the county. And plans are just stronger when they reflect the real community priorities. And also this helps us make sure we're meeting the requirements again from FEMA so that we can be sure to unlock those funding opportunities for mitigation projects for the county and for community members. And so when we think about some of the questions that, we want to know from community members, it's, what concerns you most? How has your family been? Did I just get muted? Now you're muted, Shirley. Am I?
You were saying, how has your family been affected? I'm so sorry.
It's okay. That's okay. Yeah. So again, I'm just kind of running through some of the types of questions that we are wanting to ask community members. And again, these are things that they can get surfaced in our conversations with our steering committee. We have a very robust steering committee that represents all the jurisdiction in the cities and leadership and government agencies and conservation and the schools and the fire districts. And all the people working for those organizations are community members. But when you live and breathe this stuff, this subject matter, you can kind of get programmed to think a certain way. And so for us to be able to just step back and sit down and have a conversation about that thing that happened, or what if this other thing happens, that's just really important, because at the end of the day, what we want to have come out of this is families and community members feeling more informed and more prepared and more ready to safely act when something does happen. And so Speaking of that, so the engagement opportunities we're looking at here, late winter has passed, but what we've done so far in the process is we initiated the process with the county commissioners and the planning commission, and we created a website, which I'll share the QR code out for that, but it's on the Douglas County website under emergency management. We did a countywide press release and some social, and we created some flyers and just trying to get the word out through county channels and then also through the cities that this update's happening. And then we've just wrapped up a round of city meetings. We went up to Bridgeport and Mansfield, and then we met in East Wenatchee. And today, obviously, we're having this discussion with the webinar that we'll put as a resource on the website. Again, because not everybody has the ability to show up to an open house or a focus group, and we have life and families and dinner to cook and work. And so we just want to make sure that for people who are curious or want to ask questions, have an avenue to do that. And then really after this, we just plan to get into tabling and showing up where community members are. So there's a lot of spring and summer fairs and community events that are happening all over the county. And so we just want to make sure that us and this information is available so that we can just let as many people know as possible that this work is happening and that that there are ways to provide feedback. And then as Shirley had mentioned, you know, we're on a pretty quick timeline because we're playing a little bit of catch up. And so we're going to kind of wrap this up in parallel with the comprehensive plan. And so then any opportunities for us to also share information about the hazard mitigation planning process or get community feedback where comprehensive plan events are happening, we're going to do that too. And then, of course, there's the public comment period that'll happen later this summer and into fall. And during the public comment period, anybody has access to review the documents and to submit feedback that goes back to this team who is working on the updates. And so for more information, I think that the big resource is the QR code on the left. So that is the hazard mitigation webpage, and we are keeping all of our resources there, our steering committee meetings, any presentations, a calendar of events, and any materials that we can make available. And we're doing our best to make sure everything's also available in Spanish. And that's also why we have Daniela on the team who is going to all these events in different spaces with us just to make sure that we can fully connect with community members. And then I just wanted to share a few other resources that I think are good for curious people, but also I think the one at the top, the ready.gov, I think this is just such an important website for anybody who's thinking about is their household ready? Do you have the resources and the plans that you need to be able to quickly and safely respond in the event of a hazard? And then also just to be able to find more information on the FEMA hazard mitigation planning requirements, our wonderful Washington State Emergency Management Division, and then also a bit about the climate resilience. And so that comes from the Washington State Department of Commerce. And then we also have a great tool that's been developed just for us in Washington, and that is through the University of Washington. And it's a mapping tool that allows you to look at your county or even zoom in closer to see how the hazards that we were just talking about are changing over time. And with that, that brings us to Q&A.
And I'm going to do what I was trying to do before, which is ask everyone to unmute. There's only a few people here, and I know who three of them are. So,
Yes.
but it would be great if anybody had any questions for you, Mandy. And if not, I have some questions that I would love to get into the recording. So
Perfect.
we can start with that. I don't see anybody unmuting or waving their hand or being crazy. I wasn't going to have people raise hands or anything. And I don't see anything in the chat. So I will go to some questions for you. And then if that spurs anybody's, thoughts or memory or interest, I will bounce over and let them ask questions. Um, so, number one, can you kind of reiterate how this is different from an emergency response plan that the county already has?
Yes, that's a great question. So, the emergency response plan covers what happens during a disaster. So, thinking about evacuation routes, shelter locations, who's in charge. It's an important one. And the hazard mitigation plan focuses on what we do before the disasters happen to reduce risk. So, they work together, but they serve very different purposes.
Thank you. The next question I have is this one of those plans that's just going to sit on a shelf, or does it actually get implemented?
Yeah, I think that's a fair concern. And every action in the plan is assigned to a responsible department or agency or organization, and it has a timeline associated with it. So we also will formally review progress every year and then report back. And like we mentioned, Shirley, you mentioned earlier in the process, a big part of the audit is looking at where are we stuck? Where are we moving? And what maybe hasn't even happened since the last update. And so that's really important to make sure we're staying accountable to those actions. And so I guess the way that FEMA might look at it is the grant funding access in a way, becomes a built-in incentive to work the plan. And so the plan opens up money to the projects. And if you do the projects, then you'll get more money to do the projects. And so it just helps us to make sure we follow the plan.
So it's incentive to keep moving on it because the more you do, the more you do, the more you get. Because you're back on that wheel.
Yep.
The next question, how does climate change planning affect my property taxes or regulations on my property, like building code or zoning code?
Yeah, so the HMP itself doesn't change zoning or impose regulations, not like the comprehensive plan might. And so again, we are incorporating climate into the hazard mitigation plan and not into the comprehensive plan itself. So it will identify and prioritize these actions, some of which may eventually evolve into policy that would go through a normal public process with full community input. So I think, yeah, it does not um, impact taxes or regulations unless it goes through a normal public process.
If someone lived in a specific area and was concerned about their neighborhood being at risk, how could they find out more and what is this plan going to do about it?
Yeah, so as part of the HMP process, we develop detailed maps, and we do this in every update. We've actually already started creating maps for multiple communities in the county. And then the best way to make sure an area gets proper attention is to help is honestly when folks are in these meetings or they show up to our events or tabling and they look at the maps and they grab a sticky note and identify if something's missing or if something's in the wrong place on the map. And so we definitely encourage community members to look at any of the maps that are made available in this process because, as much as we appreciate the technology and the tools that we get to use, there's nothing like the value of the human eye.
As we've learned. And I didn't know that I was not aware. I mean, I knew there were landslides up near Bridgeport, but I didn't know where until somebody actually
Mhm.
pointed at the map and said, this curve right here on this road gets washed out. So it's good to have someone
Exactly.
talk through that with you. Um, do we have an idea on what has actually been done from the last plan?
That is a great question, and that is something that will be communicated out shortly. So the teams are working right now on auditing the last plan, as well as updating the community profiles. And so I think probably in the next month, we should see a lot more about that, which means then that we can take that information and share that when we do community outreach.
Um, okay, I have a question for Marie. And let me see if I can read it here. Marie says, thank you for doing this. It's hard sometimes to get to an in-person meeting. I totally understand that. I was wondering who or what group sorry, I'm struggling with pop-ups here. Who or what group are the ones making decisions, like where the funds go and how they come to the conclusion of what takes the most priority? Hope I worded that correctly. Yes, you did word that correctly. And then we'll get to your next question after Mandy answers that first question.
Yes, and surely you might have an opinion on this as well. So this plan sits within the county's emergency management division, and so the emergency management team is responsible for shepherding the plan, I would say. But in terms of the actions, and as I was talking about a little bit ago, the all of the agencies and action owners, I guess, the responsible parties for the actions, they play a role in applying for funds and for managing those funds. And so really the HMP is an interesting document because unlike a comprehensive plan, so a city or a county does a comprehensive plan, and then it is the departments within that city or in that county that execute the comprehensive plan, right? So you're kind of looking at the same team doing the work. Whereas a hazard mitigation plan is community wide. And especially as we look at a county level hazard mitigation plan, you have a lot of stakeholders because you have your different fire districts and school districts and so on. And so deciding where the money goes is, I think that while a lot of those decisions sit at the government level or within the respective agencies, the opportunity for the public to provide input into this process means that community members can help identify where funds should go. And that really is the ultimate goal of community input. It's not just an obligatory step in the process. And I think it helps us to keep our leaders accountable to how and where we're investing in the community. I hope I answered that okay.
I think you did. And one thing that I've learned through all of this is that the range of things that get funded for hazard is huge. It literally can
Yeah.
be replacing someone's wooden deck so that their house doesn't catch on fire, all the way up to a new communication system and ta cell tower for a rural sheriff's department.
Yeah.
So
Or
it
building another bridge across the Columbia River.
Right, exactly, so that you have a way to get out if your road
Yeah.
fails. So this is the follow-up question, and I might be able to answer this. Also, I know it was mentioned, but I was wondering why the plan has come later than usual. Does it have to do with federal funding? And were you as surprised as I was to see Oregon and Washington got approved for federal funding with all the cuts that have been happening to our government? So it's a three-parter. One, this is later than usual. It's actually funded by the state through the Climate Commitment Act. So the State Department of Commerce did a competitive grant funding for jurisdictions to say, hey, we want some help with hazard mitigation planning and climate resilience planning. And so Douglas County was awarded one of those grants. Um, I am not aware of FEMA having grants available for hazard mitigation planning at the local jurisdiction. I know that they provide funding at the state or for like big regions, but I don't know recently of any for the jurisdictions. Um, that's why it's behind. Not federal funding. Uh, Surprised about federal FEMA disaster relief money. I think that somebody could write a whole dissertation on the politics behind disaster relief funds that, we just got from the flooding. Um, I do know, and this is only anecdotally because I heard a story on the radio, is that FEMA is behind in dispersing mitigation funding. So there were people who were awarded mitigation grants that are trying to get the work done for the next fire season, the next flood season, and haven't gotten that mitigation funding yet. So I know that they're still behind on that. I can only hope that that resolves. But even if the funding doesn't resolve, the capacity building is still there, and you still identified, hey, if we can get our hands on $50,000, $100,000, what have you, this is the best way for us to spend it to meet our community's priorities. So I hope both of those answered your questions, Marie.
Those were good questions.
Those are really good questions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Um, I think that there were a couple more other general questions as I like mangle a sentence there. You're very welcome, Marie. Um, how does this connect to agricultural water rights and drought planning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will just say that this is a larger topic that's being heavily studied in the Northwest and the Pacific Northwest right now because um, our surface water availability is obviously changing, and those are things that we can see right now, especially if we live near rivers or we recreate on rivers or we like to ski. And didn't have much of a ski season this year, but the groundwater is also changing because of demand and use, and so that is something that's being heavily studied. As far as the HMP, it does not replace water resource planning, but part of the process is where we can and where it's applicable is coordinating with the irrigation districts or agricultural stakeholders to make sure any actions regarding drought would complement those efforts. So again, I think that just further shows how dependent a hazard mitigation plan is on stakeholders, and whether it's government or non-government stakeholders. It's pretty integral.
Thank you. I have one last question. For anyone who's been here this evening or watches this recording later, and they're totally fascinated and absolutely plan on reading and commenting and doing whatever, but if they want to be more involved, is there a way for that to happen?
Yeah, I would say go to the website because that is where we are keeping all of our resources, our events. We have an events calendar. We have a way to sign up for information through the county. And so we're trying to keep everything that folks want to know about the HMP planning process and ways to engage and provide feedback there, and to keep that up to date. And then there's some contact information there. And so I think if folks have specific questions, I encourage them to reach out to our project contacts, because again, we welcome and we will greatly benefit from any community input in this process.
And if somebody missed the QR code, is it pretty easy to find on the Douglas County homepage?
If you type Douglas County Hazard Mitigation Plan into Google or the browser of your choice, it will pop up. But I will also go back to this page,
Thanks.
and this might be a good final slide for us to end the presentation on so that people can see it.
I think that's excellent. Do we have any last questions? I'm checking the chat one more time before I stop recording, and then we can close out. We are we are at 50 minutes, which is, I think, an excellent amount of time for someone to watch an online webinar. Thank you so much for your time, Mandy and Daniela. I appreciate you being here as well. And I'm going to stop recording right now, and we will put this on the website. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Marie, for the questions. We really appreciate it.
Have a good evening, everybody.